Welcome, everyone. I'm Patricia Kranz. I'm the Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club. I'm delighted to welcome you to another in our series, the latest in our series of OPC winners share their stories. Tonight, we are delighted to discuss the Cornelius Ryan Book Award, Best Nonfiction Book on International Affairs by Katherine Eban. And the title is Bottle of Lies Inside the Generic Drug Boom. The head judge of the Cornelius Ryan Award, Dan Hertzberg, will be having a conversation with her for about half an hour. And then we will open it to questions. If you have questions, you can write them in the chat or you can use the Q&A function. And then we will start taking questions after that. So take it away, Dan. Thank you.
Okay, Katherine. Well, congratulations again. It was a wonderful book, I can tell you, and very readable too. But I want to point out that this book was, which Katherine a little later will sort of talk about some of the main findings, but this book was published before the whole COVID crisis, but it couldn't be more relevant right now. With the vaccines and the other things. So what I'd like to ask is looking now at what's happening with the vaccines and the international distribution of the vaccines, what do you think? I mean, what do you see that's really relevant? And your big thing was that, especially looking at India, that a lot of the plants which make, is it 50-60% of US generic drugs?
Yeah. Over the Indian plants make over 40% of our finished generic drug products.
Finished generic drugs. And the Indian and Chinese plants make what proportion of the chemicals that we use in in any of the drugs they make or
yeah, at least 80% of the active ingredients in all our drugs are coming from overseas.
Yeah. And what Katherine found very briefly is that in India, there was massive fraud in terms of their reporting, their safety standards, everything. And that the FDA, despite a few really good, heroic inspectors, really did not have a handle on any of this. And in some days, told people in advance when the inspectors were coming, which is not what they do in the United States. They just barge in. So what should we be thinking about now with COVID?
You know, the COVID has put like a massive flashing red light over our drug supply. You know, people who understood the issues before COVID knew that this was a massive national security risk to be completely dependent on India and China for our finished doses and our drug ingredients. But now in an age of COVID, we have FDA inspectors who can't go into plants overseas. We've got, you know, countries that have threatened to cut off exports to our country. We've had a huge struggle to get everything from, you know, starting chemicals to glass vials. So the whole question of a global drug supply has proved to be really dangerous and inadequate in an age of COVID. You know, now we're going to see I think we're headed into a big fight over distribution of vaccine. I'm sure we're going to have big stories about quality and questions about how these drugs are being manufactured, how they're being inspected. So I would say that, you know, this is going to the question of a COVID vaccine will really turn into one of the biggest stories, pharma stories, really in history.
It's interesting because I've been waiting, having read your book, I've been waiting for somebody to be writing about that, but they're not.
Yeah, well, we're not there yet. I mean, what everybody has been, you know, thinking about and looking at is the question of political interference in the vaccine approval process. You know, and as one person said to me, it's like the two things you never want to mix are politics and vaccines. It's like Global Health 101. So now we've got them completely intertwined. There were big questions about, was the FDA going to approve vaccines on an expedited schedule that would aid a Trump reelection bid? That didn't happen. But now, we're going to be moving into the production and distribution stories about this vaccine.
Now, is it correct to say that there's a real lack of transparency in the foreign firms that either make the drugs or make the ingredients?
There's a real lack of transparency across the board in the foreign firms, in the domestic firms, in, Operation Warp Speed, which is the Trump administration program for building these vaccine candidates. They wouldn't even publish an org chart. So there's really almost no transparency. It's
And if
pretty
they suspended, the FDA have suspended its own inspections?
That's right.
So there's even the FDA,
Yeah.
which, is not inspecting any of these vaccines, the making of any of these vaccines.
Well, that's what we don't know. The problem is if these firms get emergency approval to, if the FDA greenlights these firms through an emergency approval, they are not required by regulation to do a full inspection. That is really bad news.
And they have suspended overseas inspections?
They've been suspended overseas inspections.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, I spent 10 years in Bottle of Lies reporting on everything that can and does go wrong in these manufacturing plants. So really,
It's scary.
I emerged from that reporting experience very sure that I never wanted to take any kind of medication from a facility that had not been inspected by the FDA.
Why don't you talk a little, just to sort of summarize some of your findings in your book, which I would also want to say is very readable. I mean, it's a really fine job, but it's also a very readable book. All the judges felt that way.
Well, thank you, Dan. So the book is narratively, tells the story of a whistleblower in India's largest generic drug company, Ranbaxy, who blew the whistle on just a huge fraudulent endeavor by the company to falsify its data. So the quality data that it used to get approval from foreign regulators or any regulators, most of that data turned out to be fake. And the book tells the story of Dinesh Thakur, who was the whistleblower who really risked it all to turn the company in, to bring it to justice. But it also follows a number of other characters who basically expose how that kind of fraud is really sort of common business in the generic drug industry in these manufacturing plants overseas.
And then in the case of Ranbaxy, right, they actually did a study, a report went to the board saying there was all this fraud, and then they just buried the report.
Absolutely. Not only did they bury the report, but the board opted to destroy the PowerPoint on which, the computer on which the PowerPoint was created. They took apart the computer piece by piece to leave no trace of this report.
And in terms of what the FDA, I mean, people certainly notice this, and you've written articles leading up to the book about this. One of the problems clearly is with the overseas inspection is totally inadequate.
Yeah.
They don't have enough people. They don't have enough inspectors. Some of the inspectors are very good and heroic. Some of them aren't so good. And then there are questions about the policy, but has there been any change over the last couple of years?
Well, so, excuse me, after the book came out, I was sort of encouraged that there were a number of congressional hearings that were looking at the FDA's oversight of these foreign plants. But then COVID hit. So that just made everything even worse than it was before. One of the things that I expose in the book is the FDA pre-announces its inspections overseas. It tells the plants that they're going to come 2 months in advance. The plants actually send in data fabrication teams to alter and invent and shred data, so they know they're coming. And they even ask the manufacturing plants to arrange ground transportation and hotels.
Yeah.
This led to this system of what one of my sources called regulatory tourism. You know, the plants would send a luxury vehicle to pick up the inspector, put them up in a fancy room in a hotel, take them on outings to the Taj Mahal, and give them, you know, arrange for massages and other perks. Yeah. And you know, at one congressional hearing, the FDA said, well, we don't ask these foreign plants to arrange our ground transportation anymore. So that's not really progress.
And again, to in the US, whatever issues there are, they do not pre-announce and you described one. I mean, they don't pre-announce the inspection. The inspector just shows up and says, I'm from the FDA, and then goes and looks at things, right?
Right, absolutely. It's completely different. So, you know, those unannounced inspections have been reasonably effective in having the plants be compliant. But overseas, it just turned into this absolutely wild and sort of corrupted system. And now those inspections have been entirely suspended. So, you know, this is not good for drug safety.
So we don't even know who is going to make I realize they haven't been approved yet. We do know, was it remdesivir?
Yeah, remdesivir. Yeah.
Remdesivir has been approved as a treatment, not a vaccine.
Right.
And there's another one that was just an antibody treatment.
Right.
But do we know where these things are made?
Well, I mean, that is, you know, we sort of do, but there's been very little focus on you know, disclosing that, on disclosing what kind of inspections have taken place. And it's really even worse with the vaccines that are being developed under Operation Warp Speed, which is the big Trump administration, you know, public-private partnership to develop these vaccines. There's almost no disclosure at all. So I'm literally having to do, you know, deep dive reporting to just figure out what plants are being used to make these drugs. Yeah.
Now, by the way, am I correct that the Pfizer one wasn't done, the one that they talked about with the initial very good results, that's a vaccine. That was actually not done under Warp Speed?
So the actually, it was a pretty funny dynamic, because when Pfizer announced these phenomenal results that it had, the Trump administration was quick to say, see, this is this amazing triumph of our initiative. And Pfizer pretty much kicked them to the curb after VP Mike Pence said that publicly. They were like, nope, we didn't take any money from you guys for research and development. So, you know, Pfizer really developed their vaccine on their own, but the government, the US government, is a huge customer. So they have pre-purchased, I can't remember how many doses, maybe over 1 billion doses of the vaccine.
One of the things I want to talk about, first of all, I want to say this is mainly about generic drugs, though the vaccines are what we would classically call generic drugs. But I just want to point out, I mean, as an older person, all my drugs are generic. Yeah. You know, all the drugs I take are generic, and I look, and since I've read the book, I'm always looking at who does them, who makes them. But I mean, that's it. And one of the things you talk about there is that the pressure, the political pressure on the FDA going back to the 1990s, right? Which is that Congress wanted, all parties wanted generic drugs right now and cheap.
Right.
So they didn't care where they were made. They just wanted to get them, and they wanted them as cheaply as possible.
Right.
And we're putting pressure on the FDA.
Right. So, the FDA wants to go to Congress and say, we are approving so many of these generic drugs, here's our numbers. And now the FDA has a financial incentive to approve these because it gets user fees from the drug companies when it approves their drugs.
So actually, in a sense, the inspectors, and they've added inspectors, right, to some extent, are being financed by the drugs they approve. Their salaries are being paid by the drugs they approve.
Yes, and you might ask, well, what could possibly go wrong with that system? And obviously, the FDA has every incentive to bury bad news about these manufacturing plants, to not shut them down when they find terrible things, which they do. I mean, I think I may have read way too many of these inspection reports, but they find terrible things in these plants.
And you point out, and they make a recommendation for the toughest sort of punishment about essentially saying you can't bring the drug in, and then that gets changed at FDA headquarters.
Right, that's correct. Yep.
It's pretty hair-raising. I mean,
Yeah.
it is amazing. Can we talk for a second about the Chinese role? Your books obviously couldn't do everybody, and also because the Indian firms have been doing it longer, spent more time on the role of the Indian drug companies. What is the involvement, though, of Chinese companies in the US drug supply?
So the Chinese are really functioning as the sort of active ingredient makers for the entire world. They're making the fine chemicals that they are then selling to the companies that are making the finished doses. It actually started with antibiotics. In the 1990s, antibiotics manufacturing just slowed to a crawl here, and it was almost all done in China. There's a fermentation process involved in making antibiotics, and the Chinese have been making soy sauce forever, are experts at fermentation, and also they can do it so cheaply. And one plant after another began moving over there. So really, they are just, I mean, you almost can't take a drug that doesn't have ingredients from China.
And in terms of our inspections of Chinese, first of all, it must be enormous, the number of factories and just the size of China.
Absolutely enormous. So I tell the story of an FDA inspector named Peter Baker. He was a really enterprising young FDA inspector who sort of figured out how to get to the bottom of what was going on in the plants. But at one point, he was the only FDA inspector based in China with over 450 plants to inspect.
The only inspector.
Yeah, the only inspector, and occasionally they would send people from the US to China to inspect, but it's an absolutely overwhelming task. However, he invented a sort of method of inspection. Instead of asking for data printouts, he would look inside the computer systems, and he had a sort of a high school, college level Mandarin, and he would look in the computer systems, and he figured out that both in China and India, many of the manufacturing plants were pre-testing their drugs, trying to figure out whether they would pass specifications, and then altering the parameters accordingly. And then they delete the pre-tests because under regulation, they're required to share all their tests with the FDA. But he found evidence of this pre-testing scheme in the metadata of these computer systems.
Because he actually went in and looked at the computers.
Yeah, because he was looking.
So in effect, they were keeping, to put it simply, two sets of books and destroying one.
That's right. That's absolutely right. So, what they would show the FDA is all this evidence of passing results. But what they didn't show them was all of the pre-tests where they were toggling with everything to try to get to the passing results.
how, with your deep knowledge, I mean, one of the things is clearly over the years you've gotten in really fine sourcing and deep knowledge within the FDA and other things. How important do you think political interference has been in the FDA? I'm talking about in the US. And and obviously we can also talk about the Trump administration now, where we actually hearing about it. But
I mean, from time immemorial, political interference with drug regulation has been, intense. And it's really affected, what drug has been approved. I think it's sort of relevant that the cases in which career civil servants have stood up against interference are kind of legendary. So there was, in the case of thalidomide, which probably people have heard of, and that was the drug that was given to pregnant women to make them sleep better, and it yielded a sort of generation of kids with flippers and malformed limbs. And there was a career civil servant in the FDA who wouldn't sign off on this drug. And as a result, American women were spared the horror of what happened with thalidomide. But that's really the
which happened to Europeans, which
happened to Europeans. But that's really more the exception than the rule. And under the Trump administration, there has been a sort of to the death battle between the FDA's career civil servants and the Trump administration, which wanted to expedite vaccine approvals to come in before the election. And literally, what scientists were looking at is, President Trump single-handedly creating an entire generation of anti-vaxxers by making everybody so afraid and reluctant to take any vaccine that his administration was involved in creating.
And that's, I mean, the polling says what, 50% of people say they're not going to get the vaccine. I suspect that will get better as time goes on. But as you said, we don't know if they're going to be more adverse effects beyond the studies. Though the drug companies had to say they're going to try to make the data generally available, I think, because they feel like otherwise people won't make them.
Right. Although, this 90% effective result that Pfizer announced, we didn't see the data. We saw a press release.
Yeah.
And everybody is already losing their minds over this data, but we haven't seen it. Yeah. So, there's really first of all, you've got to see the data. But as somebody who spent 10 years reporting on data integrity issues or data fraud in pharmaceutical plants, we have to reserve skepticism here over claims of data, So we'll see about this Pfizer vaccine.
So they say they have some sort of independent outside group that looks at their trials.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I just.
Right. But so this is a 44,000 person clinical trial, and the data is drawn from 94 participants. So, we got to just wait and see on this one.
Only 94 out of the 44,000.
That's right. Yeah.
Because they had it first?
I'm not exactly clear on why that is the case, but that is the initial outtake here.
Yeah. That's good. Are there any other things you want to bring up before we go into questions?
No, let's go to questions. I think we have some already in our queue here.
Okay. Chad?
Absolutely, yes. We have a question. What do you think about the Pfizer vaccine developed with the German biotech firm?
Right. So we already, we've discussed that, and I think that It is potentially very promising, but there are still, I mean, I'm very much in a wait and see mode. And there's also, incredibly challenging questions about distribution because of it has to be kept at a very cold temperature. So there's cold chain and distribution issues. So I think we're going to see a big global fight over these vaccines, is my prediction.
In terms of who gets it and who gets it when.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. We have another question. Why have the U.S. drug companies not attacked piracy by Ranbaxy at all?
That's a good question. It's become very difficult for brand name companies to criticize generic drugs. We're in an era where they've been hauled in front of Congress and questioned about their drug pricing schemes and their salaries and their private jets. So it's kind of political suicide for any big pharma CEO to be attacking generic drug companies. But also, there's less of a distinction now between brand companies and generic companies. Brand companies have generic subsidiaries, or they're buying up generic companies. And also the global supply of active ingredient. The brand companies are getting their fine chemicals and active ingredient overseas, just like the generics companies are. So there's it's not so much an us versus them situation anymore as it used to be.
I want to say there's a lot of shocking things in your book, but one of, I thought, the absolutely most shocking was the idea that drugs that were really, in essence, really badly produced, and they didn't even try to sell them in the US, they sold them in Africa.
Absolutely. So that was like, of all the things that really surprised me in the course of my reporting, it is pretty standard in the generic drug industry to do something called dual track production, or row A, row B production. And what that is making different levels of quality for different markets. So, naively, I, going into this reporting, just assumed that a pill is a pill. And if you get, a generic Lipitor made by Mylan in the US, it would be the same as generic Lipitor made by Mylan in Africa, but not so. A lot of these companies engage in dual track production. They'll use lower quality ingredients and manufacturing shortcuts, and even manufacture the pills in different factories. So I've seen, factories overrun with monkeys and bird droppings, and those drugs, which would never pass muster, with a US inspection, would be sent to Africans, which is just diabolical. It's just awful.
We have some other questions in the queue if you're ready.
Sure.
Do you think the Chinese would have been capable of developing COVID-19 as a biological weapon?
Wow. Probably yes, would be my guess. Now, did that happen? Obviously, there's been so much speculation and reporting about that. I don't have any evidence that that's the case. But I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility, given what we know about, chemical weapons manufacture and whatnot. I mean, certainly it would be very on brand for 2020 if we find that out.
Okay, next question is, how difficult and expensive would it be for American pharma companies to reestablish control over their supply chains?
That's a huge question. And it's really a big question now in the US, because the US is trying to push towards what they call reshoring, which is, bringing manufacturing back to the US. There's a lot of obstacles to that. One is that making pharmaceuticals is actually a really dirty business. There's a huge output of pollutants, antibiotic tainted water. There's a lot of environmental contamination from pharmaceutical manufacturing, and it's had a horrible impact in India and China. So given the more restrictive laws in the US related to that, it is very challenging. There are some sort of advanced kinds of manufacturing. It's called continuous manufacturing that might reduce that sort of output of pollutants, that might make it more possible. But what you really need is a massive government intervention to try to rebuild US manufacturing.
And I get a sense that, when it's all happening very quickly, but a lot of the talk about reshoring has really been about things like masks and swabs and, very simple personal protective stuff, and even ventilators we know about. But it's, you don't get any sense that Congress is moving in any way to make, or do you think that's?
Well, I mean, there is a lot of bipartisan support for this, which the COVID really kind of lit that up because of the national security risks of being dependent on these overseas countries. But you might recall there was this just fiasco where Jared Kushner's college roommate, who now runs something called the Development Finance Corporation, which is like a overseas bank embedded within the US government, and they made a huge loan to Eastman Kodak to start manufacturing active ingredients for pharmaceuticals in the US. And within days of the announcement, the whole deal blew up because of allegations of, shady stock trading by Eastman Kodak executives. So that was the Trump administration's signature effort at reshoring. But maybe, who knows? I mean, maybe that's like a first step that went badly, and we'll see more of that without the stock trading shenanigans.
But you're saying that to actually do that with pharmaceuticals, with the ingredients, would be an incredibly big and expensive task.
Absolutely.
And obviously, what the question is, what will that mean, not only for the safety of drugs, but also for the cost of drugs?
Yeah, absolutely. It is very, very difficult, and you'd need like an all of government effort to make it happen.
Okay, we do have a couple of other questions lined up. A listener says, cannot wait to read your book. How worried are you about the Pfizer vaccine being counterfeited?
I have almost no doubt that it will be counterfeited. I mean, it's like almost certain. However, I do think that there will be intense security around it. I don't know what kind of efforts they're going to make to authenticate it with barcoding and all kinds of stuff like that. I mean, I'm sure they're building in a lot of security features to its labeling. But where there is that much money on the line, I'm sure there will be counterfeiting attempts.
There'll be somebody on eBay promising to sell you the vaccine.
Well, the problem is, I mean, I wrote my first book was all about counterfeits and the legitimate drug supply, but it's not going to be too encouraging if somebody is selling COVID vaccine from their pickup outside of a pizza parlor, especially when it has to be kept in this secure cold chain. That's the real.
And it's like, what is it, 70 below zero or something?
Yeah, it's like nuts. So, anybody who's saying that they got a super secret deal and, they've got some COVID vaccine in the back of their truck, in a beer cooler or whatever it's going to be, that's likely not going to have been maintained in a perfect cold chain. We'll see about that.
Okay, we have another question. Tell us more about what capabilities would have been necessary to make COVID-19.
Oh, that's so interesting. You know, I mean, not to kind of repeat conspiracy theory. I mean, I guess there was an infectious disease laboratory inside of China that was not far from the Wuhan seafood market. So that was sort of one of the things that I think prompted a lot of this speculation. But I think, one of the questions would be, I mean, there are coronaviruses that have been around and about, but the question, I guess, with weaponizing a coronavirus is how could you make it, perfectly infectious through airborne transmission, which is how you would turn it into a kind of weapon.
And you would have to infect
Yeah.
your enemies, but protect your population. I mean, right? In theory.
Presumably.
Yeah,
So, but I don't know in terms of scientific capabilities of steps you would have to take to do that. I just don't know.
And you really don't want to speculate if we don't.
No, I mean, I
Yeah.
really don't know about it.
Okay, we have another question lined up here. What is the temperature of the room around potential solutions to anti-competitive market entry practices, such as pay for delay, patent thickening, et cetera, under a Biden administration?
Maybe we can get a little clarification on what they mean by the temperature in the room.
Political temperature?
Not sure.
I'm looking for a text and not seeing one for clarification.
Well, why don't we assume they're talking about the political temperature?
Yeah. I am certain that the Biden administration, let's say an FDA and a Biden administration, is certainly going to be very friendly to generic competition and bringing in as many low-cost candidate drugs as possible, and would probably want to come down very hard on pay for delay and those kinds of, evergreening of patents and those kind of shenanigans that would delay generic entry. But on the other hand, I also think that they will be have more of a regulatory bent. So they're going to be hopefully scrutinizing these manufacturing plants more rigorously. I mean, we know that under the Trump administration, enforcement by the FDA has gone way down.
In what ways? In the US as well as in overseas?
Just across the board. I mean, basically the FDA, any manufacturing plant making drugs for the US market has to be inspected, or that was the regulation before COVID, had to be inspected by the FDA. And, the consequences of those inspections have been really diminished under the Trump administration. Fewer sanctions of plants, fewer punishments, fewer warning letters, those kinds of things.
Which
So,
suggests that if not the inspectors, then at the higher bureaucratic levels in the FDA, they're just not, which you wrote about in your book.
yeah,
But that seems to have increased.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We have any chat?
We are at the end of our question queue. The clarification, by the way, was about congressional and HHS and FDA appointment temperature.
Mm-hmm. I think we addressed that.
It does strike me, and again, this is totally, I'm not doing about Washington, or incredibly knowledgeable about Washington or anything else, that coming out of this, for the drug companies overall, this is going to be seen as a real PR or even political plus for the drug companies, because they have, it appears, very quickly, given how long it has, been able to come up what we hope will be 1 or 2 or 3 vaccines and also some treatments. And that is, I mean, you know, they've been able to do that. And that, again, we have to make sure these things work. So I'm wondering to what extent there's going to be a political appetite for going after drug companies.
Well, look, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that can go wrong. So I think we have to really wait and see. I mean, there was, I think it was an H1N1 vaccine that proved to lead to really devastating symptoms of Guillain-Barré syndrome. So there's a lot that can go wrong with these vaccines, both in a public health way, and also there's a lot of questions about equitable distribution and payment, you know. So I think these drug companies understand that this could go south on them very quickly. I mean, they're really in a minefield when it comes to public opinion.
Yeah. And it's interesting that in the case of Pfizer and others, they basically got all prepared to manufacture the drug before they even knew if it was going to work or not.
So that is the result of Operation Warp Speed, because what Operation Warp Speed did was sink money into these candidates and say, you're going to do all this stuff in parallel. You're not going to wait for approval. You're going to make the doses in advance. And they're going to sit in the warehouse. And if you don't get approval, we're going to destroy them.
So they've actually made some of these drugs? And they're sitting in warehouses.
They've made the drugs, and we still don't know where they've been made, whether those plants have been inspected. Many of the drugs are made. The ones that don't get approval will be destroyed. Now, will there be a gray market for those? Are they going to get destroyed or, you know, smuggled out the back door? We don't know.
That's great.
Yeah.
We have another question about China. Could Chinese abilities with CRISPR technology have played a role in inventing a virus? Is that even possible?
I don't know enough. I don't know enough about CRISPR to say that. I mean, and I'm not aware. You know, on the one hand, I'm not aware of any evidence that China did invent this in any way. On the other hand, you know, there has been a tremendous lack of transparency from China about the origin of the virus. So there's been a lot of restrictions around teams that have wanted to come in from the World Health Organization and inspect. You know, I would imagine these are big questions that hopefully will, you know, answers will emerge in the coming year. You know, that we really still don't know enough about the origin of COVID-19.
That is the end of our question queue at the moment. If anyone else, oh, hang on, we just got one. Separate from COVID-19 vaccines, how will the general policy of drug importation from, for example, Canada or other foreign markets create risks in the US drug supply chain? What can be done to reduce this?
Oh, there are real risks to this. So, you know, the idea of importation or reimportation is the idea that's introduced every time we sort of hit the wall from our failure to regulate drug prices in the US. You know, our drug prices are so high, politicians can't solve that because they refuse to regulate drug prices. So what they suggest instead is importation from Canada. And the whole idea in the American psyche is that those Canadian drugs that come from nice, clean Canada and surrounded by snow and all of that, and it's all good and safe. But in fact, we really don't know where so-called Canadian drugs are coming from. Do they originate in Canada? Are they, you know, from Canada by way of Pakistan? And in fact, a lot of those Canadian pharmacies have fine print that say, you know, if we don't have the drug in stock you authorize us to obtain it from our offshore partners, which is, yeah, you don't really want to have a drug from any offshore partner of anybody's. So there is, I think, a lot of risk in reimportation. And in fact, Florida recently, they basically, through the Trump administration, opened up this platform for, importation partners, people to import drugs, and didn't get any takers. So I don't think it's as feasible as people think. I don't think it's safe, personally.
Okay. We have a couple more questions lined up here. Who would you suggest that the listener read from, follow on Twitter to follow the policy and regulatory sides of pharma?
Well, there's a whole website publication that's really doing the most detailed pharma reporting, which is called STAT. Are you familiar with STAT? So they're doing, they're really like on the front lines of pharma reporting. So I'd certainly follow them and like sign up for any of their newsletters, which are pretty informative.
I just want to say, having sitting on some award juries, their stories they do some really fine work.
Yeah, they do. They're very good. Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on HR3?
What is it? I don't know. What is HR3?
I don't have clarification on that.
All right.
If I could,
I don't know what it is.
Yeah. I'll chime in when I get an answer here. Oh wait, here it was Pelosi's Medicare price negotiation bill.
Oh wow. I don't know that I know enough about it to say.
You just want to explain very quickly Medicare, the idea of Medicare negotiation for anybody who doesn't know.
Yeah, I mean, the issue, I think one of the big issues with Medicare is that under the Bush administration, the government basically removed its ability to negotiate prices in Medicare, which is nuts. Like, why wouldn't you negotiate prices? I mean, that's how.
Which virtually every other developed country does.
Right. I mean, it was just a pure gift to the pharmaceutical industry. And, because of that, we've had runaway pricing year after year after year. So I don't know the details of HR3, but I know that that is something that, everybody keeps coming back to as a massive problem for our drug pricing policy.
Great. We do have a question comment here.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, this was a really excellent talk. I'm a student at the University of Toronto taking a course on health and pharma, and many of my classmates read your book. What would you say to young people who have read your book and want to take action?
Oh, this is a great question. And I've gotten a lot of these, questions about how do we take action. I wish I had a better answer. The problem has been that the usual consumer organizations have viewed any discussion about generic drug quality with suspicion. They think it's a kind of stalking horse for a big pharma agenda. And they have been mostly activist on the question of cost and access, right? But of course, the problem that the book exposes is a low-cost drug is not a good deal if it doesn't work. So that's been part of the stumbling block in getting really a consumer revolution going. That's what is needed, is a consumer revolution. Now, that said, there is a growing awareness about this issue on Capitol Hill. Elected officials have become more responsive. There are efforts underway by certain groups to create a kind of accreditation system for generic drug companies, to kind of a good housekeeping seal of approval. So there are, efforts underway, but there's no kind of one clearinghouse right now for activism on this. So,
But let me just ask, if the FDA can inspect these things and guarantee, why would some seal of approval organization be able to, which doesn't have the resources of the FDA, be able to do it? I mean, it really makes you wonder.
Right. Well, the idea would be that, because of the growing awareness that all these drugs are not the same and some of them are really low quality, generic drug companies that wanted to distinguish themselves from the crowd would open themselves to further audit, further review, maybe testing of their drugs, and thereby get some sort of distinguishing accreditation from an outside monitoring group.
But you would have to, I mean, if they don't do that for the FDA, what would it matter if it's some outside monitoring group that doesn't have the expertise I'm just asking.
Right. Well, of course, now you've put your finger right on the entire quality crisis of our drug supply, which is everybody assumes if the FDA says it's okay, it's okay. And we know that that's not true. So the question is, could you build in some further quality assessments? Like there's a pharmacy in Connecticut. It has a new disruptive model, which is that it tests every batch of drugs that it dispenses. So, it is basically acknowledged FDA approval is not enough. We've got to test as well.
So they actually chemically test.
Yeah, and this little pharmacy in Connecticut is the one that figured out that there were all these carcinogens in Zantac. And they filed a citizen petition with the FDA to get it pulled from the market.
Now that still isn't the issue of efficacy or even safety. I mean, but it's looking for bad things, bad chemicals. Basically.
Right, but the fact of the matter is there are carcinogens in FDA-approved drugs. We've figured this out with the valsartan and losartan, these blood pressure medications, which have been found to contain carcinogens, and they've been recalled from the market. That's been a huge scandal in our own drug supply. And by the way, the active ingredient that contained these carcinogens came from India and China. So there you go.
Yep.
We have another question lined up here. Other than COVID-related medicines, what other kinds of medicines are the most likely to be substandard, counterfeit, or otherwise high risk from a quality perspective? And they clarify drugs such as cancer drugs, diabetes drugs, cholesterol medicine.
There was no particular class of drugs. It was really across the board. The one issue in particular was any slightly more complex drugs like time-release drugs, and the generic drug companies have to invent their own time-release mechanisms because those are all separately patented. And so, wherever you had any slightly complex drug, those were found to have serious problems. But also, drugs that require precise dosing. They're called narrow therapeutics index drugs, like cardiology drugs, endocrinology drugs, neurology drugs, where slight variations can even mean the difference between life and death. In the book, I write about immunosuppressants for heart transplant patients, and patients who have gotten organ transplants have to take that their entire lives. And it was found at the Cleveland Clinic that heart transplant patients were suffering organ rejection when they were switched to a generic immunosuppressant that was made in India. So it's really, it's across the board.
I must say, journalistically, it sounds like there are about 5 years worth of stories and just the things you talked about today.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, it's a lot to wrap your mind around for sure. And it's a big global canvas. So just from a reporting point of view, it was extremely challenging to try to connect all these dots across the world, which is probably why the book took me so long.
Again, I highly recommend it, and I see some people who have read it feel the same way.
Speaking of how long it takes to write a book, someone's asked, what is your next book?
You know, I'm reporting sort of around the clock on COVID-19 for Vanity Fair. And some people have said to me, oh, well, you know, you should do a book about COVID-19. And my thought is, God, does anybody right now want to read a book about COVID-19? You know, after like a scary day in quarantine, do you want to unwind at night?
Well, I seem to be able to sell books about the Trump administration. That seems to be a bestseller.
So I don't know. I don't know if it's a book about COVID-19 or something else. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Well, this seems like a good point to wrap up. Thank you so much, Catherine and Dan. It was a very fascinating and extremely alarming conversation. But your reporting is incredible, and we hope the FDA tries to do its job better.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Dan, and thanks, Patricia, and to the Overseas Press Club. It's really an honor to participate in this forum. I just want to thank you.
And I'm doing it in quarantine, so.
Oh, there you go. You're on lockdown there?
There you go, yes. So. But we'll all survive, so.
Let's hope.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.